little...
I think it's up and running. There's
Okay.
2 people up there.
Okay, then we should just leave it the way it is.
Probably for now.
Okay. Good morning. Good morning. I'm Judy Lipton. I'm the Associate Dean for Experiential Education here at Case Western Reserve Law School, which means that I get to take our students out into the community, which is a great job. I'm so happy to welcome you all here this morning. We waited a couple of minutes because we actually have an overflow room and we wanted to make sure that the sound was working upstairs. So hello to the people upstairs. We'll figure out how to let them participate too as we start having more of a discussion and less of a presentation. I want to very, very briefly start by saying how amazed and excited we are that over 160 people registered to come here today to talk about providing services to survivors of human trafficking and addressing the systemic issues that enable traffickers to prey on such vulnerable women and men. That's incredibly exciting. I want to first, before we do anything, thank Maureen Kenny for all the work she's done to put this day together. Work and her commitment, we wouldn't all be here at Case today. So I'm going to get us jumping right in so we get back on schedule, and it's my pleasure to introduce Michael Scharf, our co-dean. Our other co-dean, Jessica Berg, is standing in the back. They have provided Maureen and I with phenomenal support to start the program here at Case, and their unending commitment to work to enable us to expand it. Michael's background in international human rights makes him a particularly exciting resource to us as we address all facets of human trafficking. So I'm going to move us right along and introduce Michael. Okay.
Good morning, everybody. So as Judy was saying, this is a unique law school where we have co-deans. We're extremely collaborative here. And so on behalf of Jessica Berg, the co-dean, and our faculty, which is now ranked 25th in the CISC study as most cited faculties, I am very pleased to welcome you to Case Western Reserve University School of Law's Human Trafficking Symposium. We hope this is going to be the first annual of such symposiums. Now, as Judy mentioned, this symposium is particularly meaningful to me as I have dedicated my professional life to pursuing international human rights and combating international crime. Today's conference is just one of many exciting events that we are hosting this spring at the law school, and I hope you all picked up our event brochure. Perhaps most relevant to this particular crowd, on April 15th, after you get your tax refunds or you filed your taxes, we're going to be hosting a lecture at 5:00 p.m. by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And so we hope you'll be back for that, or you can just tune in because all of our major lectures are broadcast over the internet, and you can just tune in and watch it from home. I want to also especially thank Professor Maureen Kenny and Associate Dean Judy Lipton for their part in organizing this really terrific event. And it makes it even more extraordinary because usually we have a year to ramp up on these things, but they started rather late because the grant that is sponsoring this came in, and they have just been able to throw together one of the best run and attended conferences that we've had. We have over 150 people joining us today, and so only 100 fit here. And remember that throughout the day, that there's going to be another 50 or so people up in the overflow room. If you want to go somewhere where you can chat and be a little more relaxed, you're welcome to go upstairs and do that, and you can go back and forth during the day as well. You don't have to stay in one place. This particular conference would not be possible but for a grant that we got from the Ohio Attorney General's office for our new comprehensive program to aid and combat human trafficking. And there's a whole lot of exciting things going on in that area that you'll be hearing more about throughout the day and in the coming weeks. Attendees at this conference include judges, attorneys, those in the medical, social work, educational, and other related fields. And this makes sense because human trafficking today is truly one of the few things that hits society at the cross-section of all of those disciplines. That is why Case Western Reserve Law School is so pleased to be active in this cause, especially by opening our new human trafficking law clinic, which has two functions. First, to serve the survivors of human trafficking, and second, to provide educational and awareness opportunities to service providers, our students, and the community. And indeed, the clinic has already formed valuable partnerships with many other entities in Cleveland doing important work serving human trafficking survivors. And when I list these entities, if you're affiliated with them, I would love it if you could raise your hand so we know where you are. First of all, the Renee Jones Empowerment Center. Anybody? There you go. Thank you. And SOAP, which is Stop Our Adolescents Prostitution. Thank you. The Rape Crisis Center. And finally, the Collaboration to End Human Trafficking. So thank you all, and it's great to start collaborating with you, and many of you are from other groups that we will be reaching out to in the coming weeks as well. All of these entities have set up information tables outside of our rotunda, and so please feel free to visit those and pick up their materials. The work that we are all doing is so important because human trafficking is a huge problem with both international and domestic ramifications. And that's why you notice this is a unique place. We have a UN flag and a US flag. You don't see that everywhere you go, but this is truly a global and domestic phenomenon. And Ohio, unfortunately, ranks 5th highest in prevalence of human trafficking in the United States. So this is also really a unique close to home problem for us. The problem is only growing. Human trafficking now ranks as the 2nd largest criminal enterprise on a global scale. And the biggest challenge that most experts cite is our failure to first understand the problem, second, recognize the signs of human trafficking, and thirdly, effectively work towards reducing the growth of the criminal enterprise. That's why we are so pleased that we have wonderful speakers here today who are going to share much needed information on this extremely important and timely topic. We thank you all for your participation, and we look forward to your insights, and we hope you enjoy your stay at Case Western Reserve Law School. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean Scharf. Welcome, everyone. My name is Maureen Kenny, and I, along with Dean Lipton, am the co-director of the Human Trafficking Law Clinic here at Case Western Reserve. And I also want to welcome you here today. We are so thrilled to have such a big turnout, and more importantly, to have such wonderful presenters here to educate us on this extremely important topic. So we are running a little bit behind, so I just want to go ahead and jump right into my presentation. My first presentation today is kind of to introduce you to some of the basic laws dealing with human trafficking, and also to some of the real statistics on human trafficking, some of which you may be aware of if you've already worked in this field, some of which you may not be aware of even if you have already worked in this field. Certainly the more I look into it, the more I learn every day. So first of all, in human trafficking at this point, we have 20.9 human trafficking victims. So in other words, there's 20.9 million human trafficking victims globally. This is more than any other time in history. So it's really difficult when we tell our children now that slavery has ended, we're really not telling them the truth, because indeed it's worse than any other time in any of our histories. With respect to where it touches us everywhere. Human trafficking is going on in every country in the world. If you look at the Trafficking in Persons report that comes out every year, here in America, it's in every single one of the 50 states. As Dean Scharf mentioned, it's the 2nd largest criminal enterprise behind drug trafficking globally. As far as human trafficking being recognized as a crime, it didn't become recognized as something specific as a crime until 2000, and that was under federal law, under the Victims Protection Act of 2000. And the Victim Protection Act essentially said that defined human trafficking in two ways. First, sex trafficking, which is a commercial act that is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. And then it also separated out labor trafficking. This is obtaining a person either by transport, but it doesn't necessarily have to be by transport, for labor services by use of fraud, force, or coercion. So those are the two separate types of human trafficking. So when you hear human trafficking, it's not necessarily sex trafficking, which is really prevalent much more here in Ohio and domestically. It can also be labor trafficking, which is really that involuntary servitude. In Ohio, we didn't pick it up as a specific crime until 2010, in Ohio Revised Code 2905.32. And we combined the two crimes together under this code section and said that no person can recruit, lure, entice, etc. If you know that the other person is going to be subjected to involuntary servitude or be compelled to engage in sexual activity for hire. So again, those two separate types of slavery, essentially, is human trafficking. And this is something that a lot of people get a little confused about, because I think they think that trafficking means that you have to be moving someone from one spot to another. Excuse me, and that's not required at all for human trafficking. There's no moving someone or harboring someone between state lines or across country lines. That's not required for trafficking. Here in Ohio, a more recent change to our laws, and I'll talk a little bit more about the safe harbor laws that came out in 2012, but a really good change in our laws is that compelled was redefined to make it clear that the compulsion element doesn't have to require some type of physical exertion. In other words, you don't have to force someone physically into human trafficking. It can include if the victim's will is overcome by duress, fear, or fraud. And I highlighted fraud because that's really a huge one that I think you're going to hear a lot about today, not just from me, but a lot of our other speakers. Most of the victims that we deal with, and we like to refer to them as survivors, but legally we have to refer to them as victims because that's the way that they are entitled to their special services. So most of the victims that we deal with generally get into the life of prostitution / trafficking by fraud. And what I mean by that is that they are generally vulnerable in some sense, either because they are in need of food, they are in need of drugs, they are in need of money, and someone takes advantage of that vulnerability and then says, I'll be your friend, I'll take care of you, and then befriends them and gets them into the life. So often what we have is what you would refer to as the boyfriend type pimp, which is the trafficker, which is another name for a trafficker, that often down the road then becomes the guerrilla type pimp. So once he gets them under his control by being kind to them and sweet to them, often giving them the love that they very much need because they're not getting it anywhere else, he then turns around and controls them by other means, often by physical violence, which we'll talk quite a bit about today as well. The average age that a person becomes a sex trafficking victim in the United States and in Ohio is between 12 and 14 years old. So these are very young victims. Often, unfortunately, we don't get a chance to service them until they're much older than that. They've already been in the life on the streets for years and years. As you've seen in some of our materials, this is an extremely profitable industry, which is why it keeps growing and growing. At last measure, it was a $150 billion industry. As far as the specific profits for this, as you can see on the slide, it's fairly separated between the Asia Pacific areas, $51.8 billion that they make annually compared to the developed economies in the EU. So here, us in America, make about $46.9 billion. And then the rest is kind of separated between Central America, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, who make much less per year from this particular crime. As far as annual profits per victim, per sector of exploitation, this really shows the difference based on the exploitation of the victims and really shows why especially sex trafficking has grown so much here in America. Sex exploitation, $21,800 per victim. And when you talk to some of the ex-pimps who will come and speak at conferences and talk about why did they do this, why was it so profitable, they'll be very honest about the fact that for sex exploitation compared to labor trafficking or trafficking in drugs, you can only sell that product once, whereas for sex trafficking, they could sell these girls over and over and over again. And so that's why it's so profitable. And you really see that on this slide here, where they're making 4 times as much for exploiting people for sex rather than labor exploitation, agriculture, or domestic work. There was a study done here by the Urban Institute that looked at what the underground sex economy was, how profitable it was, and they looked at different segments of America. And so they did a comparison in Denver, Colorado, looking at the underground sex economy. And there it was $39.9 million annually that folks were making off of the underground sex economy, compared to in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1 year, $290 million, just in that one city. As Dean Scharf mentioned, here in Ohio, we are the 5th largest city with respect to human trafficking. And a lot of folks that I talk to ask, how is this possible? Because most of the other states are more, I think, states that you would probably expect. California, Texas, New York. Why are we here at the top of the list? Generally, it's attributed to, we have a very good highway system. It's very easy for people to get back and forth in Ohio. We're very close to Canada. We also have a very high number of strip clubs, which generally feed this type of industry. We also have a very high number of truck stops, which also feeds this industry. It's a huge problem in the area of human trafficking, especially with young children being trafficked at truck stops. So as I said, we're number 5, but last year with the 2015, the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, we came in 4th as far as the number of hotline calls that came in. So at this point, we still are ranked number 5 as far as the prevalence, but as far as hotline calls, we were number 4, ahead of New York last year, right behind Florida. As probably a lot of you have heard, Toledo is considered a bastion of sex trafficking. It's been ranked the 4th biggest rate per capita because of the level of sex trafficking that takes place there. So what types of human trafficking take place in Ohio? 88% of the human trafficking that takes place in Ohio is sex trafficking. So again, here in Ohio, and we often talk about the chicken and the egg phenomenon. Is this partly because we're not good enough about identifying labor trafficking? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, but certainly the statistics with respect to what we are identifying and what's being reported, it's much, much more prevalent in the sex trafficking area than in the labor trafficking area. And that's dispositive of the United States as a whole, too. That United States domestically, we have much more sex trafficking than we have labor trafficking, which is the inverse of the global economy. Globally, there's much more labor trafficking than there is sex trafficking. So I'm not sure what that says about us in the United States. So the origins of the victims, this is something that I get asked a lot too, is when I give talks on this, people will ask me, so where are these people being trafficked from? Are they being trafficked from India or Thailand? And I always answer no. The 84% of the human trafficking victims that we deal with here in Ohio are born in America. So we're not talking about foreign-born alien citizens. We're talking about people that are U.S. citizens that are being trafficked here in Ohio. As I mentioned, Ohio Safe Harbor Law that came out in 2012 really marked some changes that help victims. We still have a very long way to go with respect to making some real changes for victims here in Ohio. But a big change was that it changed the level of the crime for trafficking in persons. It changed it from a felony of a second degree to a felony of the first degree. which means that now if a person, and Mr. Vigneaux will talk to you later about some of the persons that they have found guilty, thanks to his great investigative work. Now if a person is found guilty of trafficking, the judge has no choice but to give the person mandatory prison time of 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, or 15 years. There's no option aside from that. The Ohio Attorney General also has an obligation to publish data about trafficking within the state. So he publishes an annual report. I attached his annual report to your materials today for 2015. So it's nice because he really steps up and is held to task for what are we doing moving forward. He also has a commission, a human trafficking commission. I'm on the legislative subcommittee of the Human Trafficking Commission, and we have regular meetings and are really put to task on each year, what are we doing to move these issues forward? Peace officer training, this is really a big one. What are the peace officers doing to train? In the past, there's really been kind of a misunderstanding, at least from the victim's perspective of the peace officers, with feeling that, okay, human trafficking victims are the same as any other domestic violence victims. And so we're really trying to get to the point of training them and making sure that they understand the trauma that human trafficking victims go through compared to other domestic violence victims, because it's not the same. In 2014, almost 5,000 peace officers completed the human trafficking training under the statute. Posters and public service information, maybe some of you have seen these at some of the places that you go, like hotels or beauty salons. The legislature picked certain places that tend to be high-risk places for human trafficking and created posters that, and they encouraged the display. It's not mandatory. I wish it was, but it's not at this point. So truck stops, hotels, entertainment establishments, hospitals, of course, where these type of posters will be displayed. And the most important thing is that that hotline is displayed. Studies have showed that the hotline is the most important thing. And it's the most important thing not necessarily for the victims, it's important for those third parties. So when third parties see something that doesn't seem kosher to them, they can say, okay, I'm gonna call that hotline number and say, I saw this doesn't seem right, I'm gonna go ahead and call. So when you look at the hotline numbers from the national the Human Trafficking Resource Center, most of the hotline calls did not come from victims, they came from third parties. So that's really important. It also set up a Victims of Human Trafficking Fund. So now any funds that seized from a human trafficking bust automatically go into that fund. It's going to be solely for victims of human trafficking. So we have not had any cases here in Ohio that have dealt with what do you do with money that have come out of those funds. As Mr. Vigneaux will probably tell you, unfortunately, a lot of the cases that we've had here have been with pimps who tend to blow their money on a lot of bling. So they'll spend a lot of money on tennis shoes and drugs, of course, unfortunately, and other things like that. So although we seek forfeiture from them, we often don't get a lot of money for our victims. But there was a case in Texas where defendants, there were husband and wife defendants who smuggled young girls from Mexico to work as call girls in their bars. And the judge ended up getting $602,000 from all of their assets, and they were able to divide that equally among their victims. And forfeiture can be really important. We talk a lot among attorneys that represent victims, even if the perpetrator doesn't have any money currently, still to file the paperwork, because there have been a couple instances where later the trafficker or the perpetrator got out of prison and then won the lottery. That actually happened once, so, or got a job. So if you don't have that paperwork in place, you're not entitled to that money. So we still always seek and file the paperwork for forfeiture of their assets. Victims also now have a private cause of action. So they have a private right of action against their traffickers where they can sue for compensatory and punitive damages. So punitive is when you're penalizing your perpetrator, and here it's in civil court, and it's unlimited. It's really up to the jury to decide how much you're entitled to. Again, we don't have a case in Ohio yet on this because this is pretty new, but an example of this that maybe some of you heard about that was pretty well known was Signal International trafficked a lot of Indian workers. So this was a labor case, and this was after Hurricane Katrina, and they of course did the typical that you hear a lot for the labor trafficking, where they said, hey, come over to America and we'll offer you residency, we'll get your immigration papers for you, you'll have a better life. They come over here, they take all their papers away from them and say, here, we're gonna pay you next to nothing and you have to work off your debt for us transporting you over here. And they lived in these horrible conditions. They were living in these basically guarded little labor camps and being fed next to nothing. They ended up getting a jury verdict of $14 million for the plaintiff. So it was really a wonderful win there that we normally don't see, but it was wonderful because this was actually a huge company that was doing this and was luckily held to task for that. Suing Johns, again, we haven't seen this a lot, but this does happen and it's starting to happen more often. Some of you might remember this case from a few years ago. Lawrence Taylor, who was the New York Giants pro football linebacker, who was in a hotel room, had sex with a 16-year-old prostitute, and she did not want to have sex with him. She was beat up by her pimp. She actually had bruises on her face before she appeared at his hotel room. And she went and she immediately went to the police, and the police basically gave him a slap on the wrist, and he pled guilty to patronizing a prostitute, even though she was 16 years old. In response to the press, he said, well, I made a phone call to a friend and he made a phone call, and it's the world of prostitution. You never know what you're gonna get. That was his answer. Like, okay, she was 16, like that's not really my fault. The jury ended up rendering a verdict in favor of him in the civil suit. So the jury also came back in his favor in the civil suit. He said in deposition, I know I'm 50, but I still like the chase, but I also like to stack the deck in my favor. I don't like to work too hard, was his answer for why he goes with prostitutes. After the verdict, he went out and smoked a cigar on the courtroom steps in honor of his victory. The other thing that now we have under the safe harbor law is that for both adults and children, a huge thing that most of them are facing after they are identified as victims instead of criminals, as they have been up until the last few years, is the opportunity to expunge their prior criminal records. So now under the law, under the safe harbor law, if they have solicitation, loitering to engage in solicitation, or prostitution, which are essentially our 3 prostitution-related offenses, they have the option of getting those expunged under the statute. The problem is that under the current statute, those are the only things that they can get expunged, and pretty much all of our clients have a lot of other related crimes, like maybe drug crimes, resisting arrest, if they're children, truancy type crimes as well. So looking outside of Ohio, as far as how these type of statutes have been interpreted, in New York, New York has done a really good job of interpreting this type of statute very broadly. For instance, in People of New York v. GM, the victim there was trafficked by her husband for several years. He forced her to purchase drugs, and she was convicted of prostitution, drug possession, and criminal trespass. And there, the court vacated all the convictions because the court said, look, clearly this is all related to her trafficking, the fact that she was trafficked. So just expunging her prostitution offense isn't really doing her much good. We need to expunge all of them, even though the statute just said prostitution-related offenses. Hamilton County here in Ohio in March 2015 was our first expungement case. There, the survivor was sexually abused at 9 by her uncle, then raped at 13 by a church official, forced to sell her body at 27 by a boyfriend. At 50, she finally kind of got her new life by having her prior convictions expunged. And in Hamilton County, the judge there has really been pretty expansive in expunging convictions. We here at the clinic at Case Western Reserve will be the first ones seeking to expunge our clients' convictions here in Cuyahoga County and around the Cleveland area. So we hope that we'll have friendly judges here in Cuyahoga County as well. We're in the process of doing it right now. We also have a proposed bill. Representative Hall here in Ohio, down in Columbus, does have a bill that's currently up for debate that would expand the offenses that can be expunged. So it would include drug abuse offenses, sex offenses, theft offenses, and offenses of violence. So essentially is kind of closing that gap to say that, look, if she's a she or he is a sex trafficking victim, we need to expunge these other like offenses as well. Last year, or sorry, now it's 2 years ago, 2014, the legislature passed the End Demand Act, which also included some additional provisions, especially helping children, minors. The first thing, which is really kind of disturbing that we even had to pass anything like this, addresses the fact that we're seeing more and more children being pimped out by their own parents or by their own caretakers. Often it might be an uncle or a guardian or a grandparent. So this provision specifically prohibits children's services. So it doesn't even give children's services the option of placing a child back with a parent or a guardian if that parent or guardian has been convicted of any type of prostitution-related offenses or trafficking offenses, as long as that child or any other child in the household was living with that guardian. The statute of limitations was also increased under the End Demand Act, so now it gives victims a much longer time to go back and seek convictions against their traffickers. So instead of 6 years, 20 years, which is very helpful because so many of our victims do not see themselves as victims for a long time. So in other words, they will come off the streets. Usually they have drug dependency issues. They have so many physical issues from being treated the way they have for a long time. So having this period of time to eventually get around to the fact that, okay, I was a victim and here was my victimizer, really helps. Prosecuting Johns, it now really changes the levels of prosecution for Johns. In other words, the men who hire these women, not the pimps, but the men who sleep with trafficking victims. So we always had in Ohio, if you were a John and you got busted, which didn't happen a lot, much more often the women got busted, it was a third-degree misdemeanor. Now they've separated out into 3 levels. So it's a third-degree misdemeanor if it's adults that you hire, but if it's a 16 or 17-year-old and you either knew that it was a 16 or 17-year-old or had reckless disregard for the child's age, it's a 5th-degree felony. So now it's a felony for sleeping with a 16 or 17-year-old. So you can try to introduce evidence that you didn't know, but if the court says that you had reckless disregard, it's a felony. If the child is less than 16, you are guilty of a 3rd-degree felony, and the court does not want you to come forward with any evidence saying, I thought this 15-year-old was 18 or 19. It doesn't matter. You can't present any evidence. So if you sleep with a 15-year-old, it's a 3rd-degree felony. The traditional focus has been on victims rather than Johns with respect to arrests and prosecutions, and there have been more and more reverse stings, but that's still just the way it has been. In 2010, and this is a really modest figure, the DOJ figure said in the United States there were 62,670 arrests in the United States, and almost 70% of them were women that were arrested. Remote testimony is another thing that's now available, especially for children, not so much for adults, but for children victims. They are allowed to sit in another room and testify by closed circuit. So it kind of conflicts with the other right for the accused to confront their accuser. So that's why it's really only limited to children that are less than 16 years of age. We are working on that to make it available to other victims as well. But at this point, that's the most we have gotten, except for preliminary hearings. For preliminary hearings, older victims are allowed to have remote testimony as well. Intervention in lieu of conviction. So the big thing that has really come out of the Safe Harbor and End Demand Acts is that now both children and adults, if they are identified as a trafficking victim, instead of coming before the judge and the judge says, okay, you're a prostitute, go to jail for a few days and just go back out to the streets, we are now saying, you are considered a victim under if you have been trafficked by a pimp, and 90% of them generally are, then we will order some type of intervention. In other words, get you some housing, get you some sexual abuse counseling, get you some drug abuse counseling, try to change this cycle that you've been in lieu of convicting you of yet another crime. And we're talking about why we're doing this under the law. And it really comes up a lot both in the social sciences and also under the legal intervention. And the big reason really is kind of dispensing with the myth of prostitution as a victimless crime. And I mean, at some point, I think I thought of it as a victimless crime until I really learned more about it. I think we all kind of had that vision of, you know, maybe there's a certain amount of glamour, or women really choose this as a profession because they can make good money, or maybe that's just what they chose because that was something that they enjoyed doing. From all the studies that those of us that have been in this area have looked at and the effects that it has on victims, generally, the victims will say that this is not a choice. The effects on the victims are generally deal with beatings, degradation, threats, having no control over the situations that they're in. In other words, once they are paid for, once something's paid for, they lose control. The rapes that they endure. With respect to rapes alone, there is a San Francisco study that just that segment of women, 70% of them said that they were raped. In Portland, Oregon, the women there said that they were raped an average of once a week. The mental effects, 68% of survivors in a study said that they suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. 50% of survivors have attempted suicide. I included a couple testimonials for you so you could kind of hear. It's very difficult, I think, to put yourself in their shoes and understand the type of things that they endure. A lot of our victims, survivors, are on the streets for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Here, this victim talks about the fact that she was with a John who pulled her in an alley, pulled out a knife. She thought she was going to die. She got raped, all those type of things. Here's another one who said she had stab wounds all over her. She'd been stabbed in her head. She'd been raped about 40 or 50 times. This is the type of life that they endure for years and years at a time. Rachel Moran, who wrote a book about her life in prostitution, and really came out, especially when there was a movement, as many of you might know, Amnesty International especially came out last year and said that we should legalize prostitution. And so she had kind of a response about legalizing prostitution and was saying that in each act of prostitution, the woman is being violated, disrespected, humiliated, and dehumanized. And here are some John quotes from John's that kind of illustrate that. This gentleman said that he uses them just like any other amenity, like a restaurant or a public convenience. In prostitution, you can pick who you like. It's like going to a vending machine. I pay for this, you have no rights, you're with me now. Prostitution is an act of force, not of love. She gives up the right to say no. We often refer to prostitution as the world's oldest profession, but I'm not sure if many people realize it's the most dangerous profession in the world. More so than fishermen. Alaskan fishermen is generally considered the most dangerous profession. It is not as dangerous as, with respect to mortality rate, as prostitution. Loggers and pilots, those are the three that come behind that. Workplace homicide rate for prostitutes is 51 times that of the next most common, most dangerous occupation for women, which is actually working in a liquor store. That's the next most dangerous profession for women. So 51 times that. Average lifespan for prostitutes is 34 years old. So percentage of those who want out of the life, who really want this kind of life, is pretty low. Those who want out of the life is generally 89%. This is not something that most of them choose. This is something that is often forced on most of them because of the circumstances that they are in. So for that reason, we at the clinic have kind of dual purposes where we are trying to serve the survivor and victims, but also provide awareness and provide services for the victims. And do things like this, where we are speaking to service providers, speaking to the community about what's going on, but also to raise awareness with respect to our students, raise awareness with respect to younger people, and raise awareness with respect to school personnel about some of our, especially younger folks who get off the street and go back into schools, that there's a real difficulty for them acclimating and getting back into society after they've been off kind of the charts and been on the streets for a while. It's very difficult for them to get back into mainstream society. So these are all really difficult things for most of us to understand what can be kind of a success story for them as far as acclimating and getting used to being back into the world after living with this repeated trauma over and over again is different for all of us. So I'm going to try to stay on course here. I tried to get through that pretty quickly. So I'm going to open it up for questions now, if anyone has any questions. She's going to walk around with a microphone.
Hello. Is the rumor true that with the convention coming, there'll be more people being trafficked?
Yes, so we have, and Karen Walsh, who is the director of the Collaborative to End Human Trafficking, is going to speak directly to that. But we have a committee that actually, I think all of our speakers serve on as well, that specifically is working on that. It's a three-pronged committee, which has a public relations segment, education segment that I serve on, and then also, Kathleen, what's it, response and protocol? Kathleen Packett, who is one of our wonderful SANE nurses. So we have been meeting for months, and we continue to meet to get ready for this. And really, we already have a whole public relations kind of blast already. We're working with RTA, we're working to get things on billboards. When looking at past Republican National Conventions or Democratic National Conventions, I don't want to single out Republicans, when you look at things, and I'm going to talk to you a lot about Backpage when I do my next presentation on children later this afternoon, things like internet ads and things like that, because that's the anecdotal evidence that we have, it can go up as much as 5 times as much. The ads for sex ads and things like that can quintuple around the week before, the week after, and certainly during the time period that it's going on. So yes, it's a huge concern for us, and that's part of the reason, honestly, we made sure that we did this symposium now, and the law school is going to continue to do more awareness coming up to the middle of July.
Just point of clarification, Professor, that's 20.9 per 100,000 per million? Your statistic isn't specific.
Sorry, did I not put, it's million, yeah. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's 20.9 million. I left out million. I'm sorry, thank you, yeah.
Quick question.
But I want to say that there are that's a conservative figure too, because there's a lot of studies that say it's closer to 27. So I did the most conservative. Go on.
Just wondering what efforts there have been made to assist women who then become involved with the Division of Children and Family Services, because obviously, you know, a lot of them enter the hospital, drugs, the child is automatically considered abused, and then they're taken away. So what efforts are being made to, I guess, educate the Division of Children and Family Services and their social workers and also the prosecutors and everybody involved, you know, to let them know that these women are, in fact, have been trafficked and, you know, help them navigate through that system?
Okay, so I'm going to have Brian speak to the prosecutor, since Brian is from the prosecutor's office, but for the Children and Family Services, that I have already done presentations for some of them, and they are involved. They are also involved in the Republican National Convention committee that we are on. Have we done enough? No, we're still trying to do more. For Children and Family Services, that's definitely a real issue that we have, certainly with our juvenile clients, because, you know, to be honest, it's the biggest issue that we have with respect to housing. What happens is that we will have our clients and they come in and they're assessed, and I would say about 50% of the time the parents want to keep them at home. 50% of the time the parents don't even want to keep them at home because they're very, very difficult to deal with. And at first I was a little judgmental, like, what kind of parent, you know, I'm a parent, what kind of parent doesn't want their, you know, you want her to go to, you know, she has an option of getting diversion and getting services instead of going to jail, going to juvenile detention. But in all honesty, these kids are very difficult. They've lived on the streets. They look at everyone as the enemy, including the cop. I mean, some of them, they get picked up by the cop. They punch the cop in the mouth. You know, they're used to. It's fight or flight. It's survival. So some of them, they bring them home and they're beating up their little brothers and sisters. And sometimes the parents have to think about, I have to think about my other children too. So, or there's like this real discord between the parents and the kids that's kind of lethal. So what do we do in those situations? Do you send them to foster care? I have to say now, I've heard it enough that I can say 90% of the time, I mean, Kathleen and I were talking about this, Kathleen Hackett, who's a sane nurse, 90-some% of the time, they run. As soon as you put them in foster care, they run. So we are, all of us are grappling with this. We all talk about this all the time. I just did a talk the other night with Sister Cecilia from the Renee Jones Center, where that is the biggest thing that all of us are grappling with, which is getting good housing for these juveniles where they will be overseen, and get love and care and attention and acceptance, but they're not going to feel like they're behind bars and they're imprisoned, because they've already felt that way. They've already felt that way before. And for us, we all feel like they've been failed. Someone's failed them already for them to end up where they are. So we need to figure out a way to stop failing them as a system. And we're all trying to figure out how to do that. We think that we've looked at models in other states that might work, where it's maybe small, like it can't be institutional. It can't be a 300-bed house. It has to be kind of small houses where they can have that kind of love. But the biggest thing is, honestly, that we all come back to, that costs a lot of money. So we need, you know, people who are willing to, people who are willing to help us make that happen. So with Children and Family Services, that's a big issue, because you're right, a lot of them get referred to them, but then a lot of them tend to run immediately too.
I'm wondering about the offenders that are going into prison for these very long sentences, whether there's an effort with the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections to develop special programs for them, because as somebody who's done extensive prison litigation, it seems to me there's a distinct possibility that the kind of behavior that they engaged in the community can continue into the prison context and perhaps beyond.
That is a great point. So I don't know if everyone heard his question, but he was saying, do you do training in prison for these offenders? That is a great point. There's actually been several really good studies done recently that and I'm going to talk about this especially with juveniles, like what are some of the key breeding grounds for trafficking, and prison is one of the huge breeding grounds. So, and I hope that Renee's going to talk about this when she gets up here, because Renee Jones, I'm on the board of her wonderful organization. One of the wonderful innovative things that she came up with was going into the prisons and training some of the men, I don't want to say training because that sounds more sterile than it is, but talking to some of the men and having real groups with some of the men and explaining to them what you're doing when you're trafficking and what this does to the women. And these men, the realization that they came to, I mean, some of them at the end, one of them wrote a poem and there wasn't a dry eye in the house when he read it at the gala. It was just amazing. So yes, that is a huge issue. And you're right, we should, so folks like Renee Jones, like individual, I think entities are looking into it. Whether there's been something specifically with the prison system as a whole, I don't know, but you've raised a really good point. You're absolutely right that that's a huge breeding ground, just like juvenile detention center is a huge breeding ground where young girls and boys, unfortunately, are recruited to be trafficked. So that's a wonderful point.
We have some questions from the overflow room.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so what work is being done with the LGBTQ community?
Okay, so they are also a part of our partnership. They're also involved with, we all come to this table every month. So to say that it's for the Republican convention is a little bit misleading, because we've all come together for this Republican convention, but we've all decided we're going to stay together and continue to work on these issues moving forward. So the LGBTQ community is a huge issue, especially when you look at a lot of times, and I hate to say this, like I feel bad sometimes that I always say women or girls, because it's a huge issue, especially with boys in that population specifically. You will see a lot of them feel, I think, somewhat rejected, or they don't fit in where they are, so they tend to be a part of that runaway population that really has that vulnerability that we need to focus on. So when we look at that population, it's a huge issue. And the community here has really focused on that and talked about what can we do to service them as well. So especially for young boys, it is a huge issue. We don't have any, I think we have one male, so we have an adult court and a juvenile court. We don't have any males in the juvenile court right now on the docket. I think we have one male on the adult court, but I assume it's going to start becoming more and more once those alliances become more cemented. Go ahead.
Yeah, when you talk about the statute of limitations, that you have it as 26 years to 20 years, I guess I do want to hope that it would not be, it would never have a 20-year limitation. There would be no years, because many times, you know, our victims, it happened when they were 9, and they didn't reveal it till they were 60. Would that ever be lifted more than 20 years? Like war crimes, you know, there's no limit on a war crime.
Yeah.
I mean, I would like to see it, no limitation, you know?
Oh, I agree. I mean, I have a client who we just barely missed the 20 years, who she would like to go after her trafficker, but we just barely missed the 20 years. So I completely agree, and I think that's one of the things that we should continue to push on. And you'll see, especially when I talk later about a lot of the legislation that's taken place with respect to children. I've seen a lot with the legislators where it's kind of half measures, that we've done a little, but we haven't done as much as we should. So I completely agree. I think we should push, because especially when you're talking about that the average age is when they're children, and a lot of them can't come to grips with what happened to them until they're much older. And the other thing is that what you see with a lot of these victims is they weren't just pimped by one person for 15 years. They were pimped by multiple people. So if they were pimped by someone when they were 12 and they want to go back and prosecute that person, it might not be till much later. So that is a real issue.
Hi, Maureen. Can you talk a little bit if you've had any connectivity with the Catch Court program? I know it's been developed in other cities, but my understanding was that we were trying to do that in Cleveland and Cuyahoga County, and I don't know where it stands, though. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. So the Catch Court was started in Columbus by Judge Herbert, and that was 6 years ago. And it's really been quite a success, and I've gone down there and met with him and seen the Catch Court. And he's had quite a few people go through his program, which is 2 years that the women go through and are diverted and receive special services instead of being prosecuted. Now here in Cuyahoga County, we have what's called the Fly Court, which Judge Cassidy, she's a municipal court judge, and that has been going on for about 9 months now. So we have that for the adults, and then for the juveniles, we have the Safe Harbor Court, which is Judge Renee. That also has been going on for about 9 months. So it's very nice for us because we have Columbus as kind of a role model for us. Their infrastructure is ahead of us quite a bit with respect to what they've been doing with their courts, what they've been doing to employ some of these young girls and older women, and what they've been doing to house some of these women and girls, mentoring them, all those type of things. So we're trying to model after them, but we're definitely in the beginning stages.
Great, thank you.
Maureen, I have a question about the House Bill 268. Am I correct in assuming that that is pending? It has not been passed? Is that what you said?
Yes, it's proposed legislation.
Proposed. Is it likely to be passed, or is there anything that we need to do to urge passing?
So the biggest hang up when I was when I was down in Columbus and speaking to folks down there, including folks at the governor's office, I think the biggest hang up to its passage is the violent crime part. I think there are folks that are very concerned that how is that going to be interpreted? And I think they're concerned that, look, I am not okay with expunging a murder. Like, what if she murdered someone? So when you look at the proposed bill, it defines all of the other three. It defines drug offense, it defines sex offense. It doesn't define violent offense. And I don't know if that's because even Representative Hall just hasn't quite honed in on, okay, what am I gonna do? Because I probably can't include first-degree murder in this because that's not gonna fly. I don't think he's gonna get that passed. So I think that's really the sticking point right now. The other thing that I know they're trying to stick in there is DNA evidence. In other words, there's a lot of studies that say that if you are picked up on a trafficking offense, it's very likely that you have committed other sexual assaults. So they would like to put in there a provision that says if we pick you up on a trafficking offense, we're going to get a sexual assault kit on you and see if we can link you to other crimes. And so that's something, I know Judge Herbert actually from the Catch Court was very instrumental in that. He feels very strongly about that this is something that we should have, that we should legislate. It should be part of the law. So that's also something they're trying to put in there. So I think those are some of the kinks they're trying to work out at this point.
Thank you.